All right, so this is something that I know a lot of you have been curious about for a while, and something we've got a lot of questions about, this whole aluminum and Alzheimer's thing. And we're going to look at melatonin, too. We've actually got a pretty big stack of research articles and reports on this. Some of the stuff goes back a few years. But we're going to see if we can kind of sift through it all, get through all the science and see if we can get to the bottom of it. And I think it's safe to say we all know aluminum is like everywhere, right? I mean, it's in our everyday products and everything. So is it really messing with our brains? Like, is that something we need to be worried about?
Yeah, it's a question that's been around for a while. And honestly, the answer is it's complicated. But there's this one article from 2011 that really stood out to me. It basically suggests that even tiny, tiny amounts of aluminum, like we're talking nanomolar levels, could actually be enough to affect how our brains work.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's kind of unsettling. I mean, where do we even begin with this? Like, does aluminum even build up in the brain?
Well, that's the first thing we got to figure out, right? And the research points out that it can be tough to actually get an accurate measurement of the aluminum levels. It seems like when scientists use brain tissue that's been preserved with certain chemicals, it can actually throw off the result. It's almost like if you were trying to analyze a cake after it's already been baked,
Right.
like the heat changes things. So to really get the most accurate picture, they've got to use fresh brain tissue.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So when they look at these fresh samples then, what do they find? What's the verdict on this whole aluminum buildup question?
Well, in one study, they looked at whole brains, and they found that aluminum levels weren't that much higher in Alzheimer's patients compared to the control group.
So that's not really giving us a clear answer then. You think that kind of debunks the whole aluminum connection?
Well, hold on. That same study actually took things a step further. They used this really powerful imaging technique called TEDx, and it allowed them to zoom in on very specific areas of the brain. And that's when things got really interesting. They actually found aluminum concentrated in the very core of senile plaques. Like if you imagine looking at a senile plaque under a microscope, right at its center, there's aluminum.
Oh, wow. And senile plaques are like a hallmark of Alzheimer's, right?
Exactly. So this suggests that it might not be the overall amount of aluminum in the brain that matters, but rather where it ends up accumulating. That could be the key to understanding its role in the disease.
Okay, so we're seeing some evidence then that aluminum might be sort of hanging out where it shouldn't be. But how could it actually be harming brain cells?
Well, think about DNA and RNA. They're like the instruction manuals for our cells, right?
Okay.
And aluminum can actually bind to them, which could potentially disrupt those instructions. You can almost think of it like introducing a glitch into the operating system of our brains.
So it's not just about aluminum being there then. It's about it interfering with these really basic processes that keep our brains working properly. I'm starting to see how even small amounts could be a problem.
Right. And it's not just DNA and RNA either. That 2011 article I mentioned, it actually lists 26 different ways that aluminum can mess with the nervous system. Everything from interfering with energy production to messing with how brain cells communicate with each other.
Wow, 26 ways.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big list of problems.
Yeah, it is. And to make things even more interesting, there's another study from 2021 that specifically looked at familial Alzheimer's disease, which is the type that has a really strong genetic link. And they found that aluminum was co-located with something called phosphorylated tau protein.
Okay, and remind me, what is tau protein again?
So tau is a protein that helps to stabilize the structure of brain cells. But when it becomes phosphorylated, it's like it gets the sticky note attached to it, and it starts to clump together with other tau proteins. And they form these things called tangles. And these tangles, they basically disrupt the normal functioning of brain cells and contribute to their death.
So it's not just that aluminum might be linked to those amyloid plaques, but it could also be involved in the formation of these tau tangles too.
That's what the research is pointing to. This study really adds weight to the idea that aluminum might actually be an active contributor to the development of these tangles, not just something that shows up after the damage is done.
Wow, okay. So this is getting really interesting, but we're gonna have to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into this, and we'll also talk about the potential role of melatonin. So stay with us.
And it doesn't stop there either. There was this other study from 2020 that found high aluminum levels in folks with multiple sclerosis and autism. And those are two pretty different neurological conditions, right?
Yeah, for sure. So is aluminum like bad news for our brains in general then?
Well, it's not that straightforward. Just because they found higher aluminum in these conditions doesn't automatically mean it's causing them, But it does make you wonder about its potential role in all sorts of neurological problems.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so this is all starting to sound a little concerning, but you mentioned melatonin earlier. Is there a chance that could help protect us from the bad effects of aluminum?
There's a possibility, yeah. One study in our stack here looked at rats that were exposed to aluminum chloride, and it caused amyloid plaques to form in their brains and something called endoplasmic reticulum stress.
Endoplasmic reticulum stress. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that one. What is that exactly?
Okay, so basically, think of the endoplasmic reticulum like a factory inside our cells. Its job is to build and fold proteins. But when this factory gets stressed out, it can mess up the production of important proteins which leads to cells not working right, and sometimes even cell death.
Oh, wow. So the aluminum chloride was messing up the protein production in the rats' brains.
Exactly, but here's the really interesting part. When the researchers gave the rats melatonin along with the aluminum chloride, it actually prevented those negative effects.
Oh, melatonin really protected their brains from the aluminum. That's amazing.
I know, right? It's pretty remarkable, and melatonin is already known as a powerful antioxidant. So it's possible that it can neutralize the harmful effects of aluminum somehow. It's definitely something that needs more research, though.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a glimmer of hope in all of this.
Yeah.
But we do have this one article here that asks, is the aluminum hypothesis dead? So what's the deal with that?
Well, that article dives into something called the Bradford-Hill criteria, which are basically a set of guidelines for determining if there's enough evidence to say one thing causes another. And to be honest, the link between aluminum and Alzheimer's hasn't met all those criteria yet.
So it's not like a clear-cut, case closed kind of thing.
Not really, no. And plus, that article brings up some interesting historical context. Apparently, back in the early 1900s, there was this dentist who was totally convinced that aluminum was the cause of all sorts of health problems, and he led this whole crusade against it. So it makes you wonder if that early campaign might have shaped public perception about aluminum, even with all the scientific research we have now.
Yeah, it's interesting how those things can stick with us. So even though we don't have a definitive answer yet, it's still worth looking into this aluminum thing.
Absolutely. Just because we don't have all the answers doesn't mean we should just ignore the potential role of aluminum. It just means we need to do more research to understand how everything works together to cause Alzheimer's. You know, it's a really complex disease, and aluminum might be one piece of the puzzle.
I see what you mean. Well, this has definitely been eye-opening. We've gone pretty deep into this whole aluminum and Alzheimer's connection, and even looked at how melatonin might be able to help. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we still have a lot to learn.
I agree. And I think that's where critical thinking becomes really important. You know, we're constantly bombarded with information these days, especially when it comes to health. So it's crucial to look beyond the headlines, really dig into the research, and be open to different perspectives.
For sure. So let's bring this back to our listeners. What does all this mean for them and their everyday lives?
That's the big question, right? And even though the research hasn't proven that aluminum definitely causes Alzheimer's, I think there's enough evidence to say it's something to be mindful of and something to consider as a potential risk factor.
Okay, so should we all be throwing out our aluminum cookware and freaking out about every little bit of aluminum we come across?
Whoa, 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 let's not get carried away. It's about being informed and making smart choices, not panicking. Remember, aluminum is everywhere. We can't avoid it completely.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some practical things people can do to minimize their exposure if they're worried?
Well, one good place to start is with your diet. Choosing fresh whole foods over processed stuff can make a difference. Processed foods often have aluminum additives in them.
Yeah, that's good advice in general, I think. Processed foods aren't really doing us any favors anyway.
Right, exactly. And another thing to be mindful of is your cookware. You don't have to toss out all your aluminum pots and pans, but it's a good idea to use stainless steel or cast iron when you can, especially when you're cooking acidic foods like tomatoes. The acidity can actually make more aluminum leach out of the cookware.
Oh, that's a good point. What about antiperspirants? I know some people are worried about the aluminum in those.
Yeah, that one's a little tricky. The research on that is still kind of up in the air. But if you're concerned, there are plenty of aluminum-free options out there now.
True. So it's about weighing the risks and benefits, I guess.
Exactly. And that goes for melatonin too. I mean, the study we talked about showed that it could protect those rats from aluminum. But we need more research to know for sure if it works the same way in humans.
All right, so maybe hold off on buying a lifetime supply of melatonin for now.
Probably a good idea, yeah. It's always best to talk to your doctor before you start taking any new supplements, especially if you have any health conditions.
Good advice. You know, as we're wrapping up this conversation, I keep thinking about this idea of aluminum as a potential tipping point for Alzheimer's.
That's interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, what if it's not the only cause of Alzheimer's? But it's like a factor that can speed up the disease process in people who are already at risk, like maybe their brains are already vulnerable somehow, and then aluminum exposure comes along and just pushes them over the edge.
Yeah, that's a really interesting theory. It makes sense considering that Alzheimer's is a multifactorial disease, which means that multiple things contribute to it developing.
Exactly. It's not just one bad guy we're dealing with here. It's this complex web of genetics, environment, and lifestyle choices.
Right, and that's why it's so important to look at this whole thing holistically. It's not just about avoiding aluminum, it's about taking care of your brain in general.
Right, things like eating a healthy diet, getting exercise, managing stress, and getting enough sleep. All that good stuff can help protect our brains.
Absolutely, and don't forget about social interaction and mental stimulation. Those are super important for keeping your brain sharp too.
So it's about taking care of our brains from all angles.
Exactly. It's all about making choices that support both our physical and mental well-being.
I love it. Well, this has been a really incredible deep dive. We've really gotten into the nitty-gritty of the